Welcome back, everybody. I'm Mr. Bob, and today I have a devlog for my dream game, Arms Race. So, what is Arms Race? Arms Race is my dream real-time strategy game where you'll be able to control a country's economy, military, political situation, etc. in the Cold War. But Bobby, you might ask, can't you just play Hearts of Iron 4 and Rise of Nations? Hoi 4 has no shortage of Cold War mods. Well, I played both of those. I like them, to an extent. But where I feel like they both fall short is that they both have a lack of depth and a lack of freedom. So what I want to have with Arms Race is a detailed military and economic simulation, because I feel like Hoi 4 has a mostly good military system, but a really abstract economy system, and Rise of Nations has a better economy system, but a really shallow military system. And while I'm sure I won't be able to implement either of those things nearly as well as these other games have been able to, I thought I would give it a crack and see if I can make something that gives both the economy and military some love. And the other thing that I want is that I want to be able to do whatever stupid crap I want to do, because nothing kills fun quite like telling the player they can't do something, especially in a sandbox. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be consequences for anything you do, but Arms Race will never tell you, no, you can't do that. So, hopefully I've made a convincing argument for why I should be making this game in the first place. With enough rambling, it is time for some programming. So the first thing I need to do is set up my build system and get a hello world running, which is easy enough. The second thing I need to do is get a blank window up and running, which is easily accomplished using the state object, which just has some basic event handling and an STL window pretty much. Now, the astute among you may notice that a blank window isn't a particularly fun game, especially because I promised that this would be a detailed economic, military, political, and etc. simulator not even 2 minutes ago. So in order to make a game, we need to be able to draw stuff to the screen in a relatively timely manner, and while the old STL renderer asterisk has served me well in the past, I want to move beyond software rendering and use the power of the GPU. And for that we're going to be using Vulkan. But Bobby, you might ask, isn't Vulkan hard, and aren't you a doofus? While both of those things are true, I've already made a few simple Vulkan projects before, and I don't want to learn OpenGL, and also OpenGL is outdated and slow and stuff, so I'm going to be going with Vulkan. This also has the added benefit of whenever I don't have a lot of progress to show for any future devlogs, I can just blame it on Vulkan being hard and everything. So without further ado, let's GPUify this window. So after writing close to 1200 lines of Vulkan code, it's still doing nothing, but it's doing so perfectly, which is exactly what we want. But I want more. Fortunately, a lot of the aforementioned 1200 lines of Vulkan code is actually infrastructure for future graphical advances, so it actually won't be that hard to draw some stuff to the screen. So with that in mind, I think the first thing I want to do is get a map rendering, because it's a map game, obviously. What I'm thinking is a globe that you can spin around with your mouse and zoom in and out of. But Bobby, you might ask, 3D graphics depend on triangles, and you're trying to draw a sphere. Surely there isn't a good way to triangulate a sphere that keeps distance between vertices mostly even, especially at the poles, and also have a low triangle count. Well, I have some good news for you, my friend who conveniently asks leading questions. Allow me to introduce to you the cube sphere. So for those of you who don't have the mental acuity to understand what I'm talking about, allow me to put this in a language you can understand. So a cube sphere is basically just a cube that you kind of inflate to make a sphere. That lends itself well to 3D graphics because it doesn't require a lot of triangles, it keeps a mostly even distance between vertices, and it looks pretty decent as well. So, in keeping with this video's theme of baby steps, first of all, we have to be able to render a textured cube with a certain vertex resolution before we can spherify it. This is rather trivial, at least in theory, as it took me a few hours to get it right, but I finally did get it right. You can see it in action here. I also added some keyboard and mouse input so we can kind of rotate and zoom around it and admire its many different sides. Anyway, spherifying this should hopefully be a little more trivial than getting the cube right, as we pretty much just have to apply a transformation to each vertex and deduce what texture coordinate each one has. So, after doing this, we have a globe. So we can spin it around and whoa! What is that? That's a pretty cool island chain. Oh yeah, and I guess there's also this other little thingy here that I should probably address. So basically what's happening is that the texture is just kind of warping in on itself at the international date line, because here the UV coordinates for the vertices jump from 1 back to 0, and because Vulkan is trying to interpolate between those two values, it ends up smushing the entire globe texture into this little sliver. This is probably a trivial fix, but being the doofus that I am, I'm going to tackle this sometime later and get into what we've all been waiting for, game dev. So this game is set in the Cold War, right? You know what the Cold War had? Countries. So I added some countries to the game, and there's literally nothing different. Because countries are an abstract concept, right? Countries need people. Where are people located? Cities. So let's get some cities added. So adding cities is actually pretty involved because I have to set up another render pipeline, another vertex shader, push constants for the mouse, shader storage buffer objects so the CPU is aware of what the GPU is thinking, a CSV file parser thingy, and probably a couple other things that I'm forgetting. But with all those things in place, we have some cities. We don't have any country borders yet, but the cities are colored based on what country they belong to. And if we open up the terminal after clicking on some cities, because I didn't add a UI yet, we can see what the city name is and who controls it. Anyway, now that we have a couple cities in our little janky 1960 world, I'd like to be able to see what cities are called and who they're controlled by when I hover over them, instead of having to open up the terminal every time. This would be easily accomplished with a UI, but, like I said a few moments ago, Arms Race lacks a UI entirely. So, we're going to amend that issue and add a UI. So adding a UI is actually, believe it or not, even more involved than adding cities, because this time we're not just adding an overlay on top of the existing globe in 3D space. Because we're moving to 2D space, we basically have to do everything we did for adding cities, but even more so, because we have to have a new texture atlas for the font, a new fragment and vertex shader, and a new type of vertex and all of its associated functions for the aforementioned 2D space. Either way, arranging pixels in a somewhat legible manner on my screen shouldn't be too hard, right?
Wrong!
So after spending literally an eternity fixing crashes and integer overflow bugs, we have arguably the worst UI ever, although you would be surprised with how much one can do with rectangles and text. Anyway, after a couple minutes, I exterminated the test text and rectangle and added a simple hover for cities, which you can see a screenshot of here. Anyway, now that we have a super basic UI framework in place, let's give Arms Race a makeover. So after spending hours upon hours in the UI trenches, I've spruced up the game's looks a little bit. You can see by this screenshot here I added a little heads-up display and an FPS counter. Notice the flag icon in the corner. That took me a minute to add because, you know, Vulkan. Anyway, I also added a little city menu and also a few more countries than cities. You can see all of their flags here. And I added semi-dynamic city size scaling based on population and whether or not it's a capital. So those of you on the right half of the IQ bell curve meme might notice that there's still no actual gameplay. You can't really do anything with these cities except look at their names and their estimated populations for 1960. How do we fix that? Well, if we remember what I said a few minutes ago about countries, we can also come to the conclusion that countries have economies in addition to people. And you can't have an economy without goods, right? So I think the next logical step is to add resource extraction and manufacturing to the game, as industry creates jobs for our virtual citizens and, more importantly, stuff for the player to do while the game's open. Oh my god, that took forever. Anyway, we have a functioning economy system now. It only took like a week, and we're also past 4,000 lines of code now. So even though it doesn't look like much, this was still a lot of work. Anyway, let me run you through what I've added. So we have 3 different types of buildings, which are mines, storages, and industries, which are all pretty self-explanatory. And we also have a basic logistics system where each building can export its resources to another building that accepts them. So to demonstrate the economy system in action, I'm just going to show some in-game footage here because this is way easier than like recording an audio track and putting screenshots up. So we have 2 mines here. We have a coal mine in Wyoming, iron mine in Minnesota. Right now, mines are just kind of like small, really small cities, or that's how they're rendered. I'm gonna fix that later because I did draw icons for these, but I just haven't like put in the time to make a whole new like render pipeline and like everything like that. So that'll be fixed later, I promise. Anyway, so. Right now, this iron mine and both the coal mine, too, are exporting to this aggregate storage in Minneapolis, right? You can see this is filling up. This has actually been running for a couple days now, as you can see here. It's January 6th. this aggregate storage is actually exporting to coal and iron plants. They're exporting coal and iron to industries in Milwaukee, right? These are slightly filled up because they are actually both exporting to a steel mill in Chicago. You can see there's no steel in here. Where's it going? If I remember right, yup, it's going to Des Moines, and this is filling up too. So, right, so we have a supply chain. You have two mines going to Minneapolis that are going to Milwaukee, going to Chicago, going to Des Moines, right? So, pretty cool. Anyway, now that we have an extremely crude manufacturing system, those of you with memories longer than those of Goldfish will remember that about 10 minutes or so ago, I promised that Arms Race would also have a detailed military system. So I think the last thing I'll do for today's video is fulfill that promise, or at least begin to, and start coding the foundations of at least an army system. This should be way easier than the economy system because I'm not planning on adding combat or supply or anything like that just yet, so I think just adding a couple types of brigades will suffice for now. So anyway, after writing some of the worst code of all time and potentially dooming this game to perpetual spaghetti hell, we have some brigades on the field in central Illinois, complete with no manpower or equipment. If I poke the game data a little bit though and give these guys some much needed firepower, we can see that they have some rifles, APCs, and tanks. Internally, this works almost exactly the same as how storages store resources, except it's a little more complicated because we need to be able to mix equipment of the same type. So if I poke the game data again, we can see that this tank brigade has some M48s and some M60s in its reserves. So while the military system doesn't really do anything at all right now, I personally think it's a good start because like everything else in this game, it ain't much, but I can always fix it later. And with that, I think it's time to wrap up this installment of Arms Race devlogging. I've literally been working on this for almost a month, but this was probably the hardest part because I can reuse a lot of the existing boilerplate from this video to make future development easier. Before we say goodbye, I'm going to take a second to address some comments from the last video. And anyway, thank you very much for watching. Make sure to subscribe as to not miss more slop similar to this video, and join the Discord too, as you, yes, you, can help me make this game better if you have any suggestions, questions, concerns, or historical data you want to share. And with that, see you next time.